Hello everyone, my name is Rochelle Innocent and I'm the founder and CEO of Project Purpose. Welcome to our channel. Our community is focused on fostering the intellectual and character development in children. We do this through our parent-child workshops that focus around 4 themes: autonomy, self-efficacy, compassion, and self-concept, in order to cultivate grit, perseverance, and resilience in each child. At Project Purpose, our overarching mandate is to renew and rebuild families, communities, and relationships. Our YouTube platform provides us a space so that we can have discussions on all topics that relate to families, communities, and relationships with ourselves as well as with others, with a primary focus on mental health and education. More precisely, the ways that the institutions of mental health and education have played a role and are currently playing a role in our societies at large. Our discussions and debates provide us an opportunity to think critically about what needs to change within these structures in order for us to live up to our bold slogan: support, protect, and empower each child through youth-focused development, better known as leadership in juvenescence. We recognize that in valuing our children's leadership potential, that also translates as recreating and co-creating spaces, both socially as well as politically, in order for our children to thrive. Now, as is the YouTube convention, please do subscribe, hit that post notification bell so that you're aware of every time we post. And of course, if you like the conversation and you want to keep these conversations going, please do like, comment, and share this video. Let's get into it. Hello. So happy that you've joined us again for another week of discussion and debates, and this week's theme is mental health. So as a bit of a precursor to our discussion today, I had mentioned that on our YouTube platform, we're really aiming to focus our conversations around 3 themes. So around mental health, education, as well as mental wellness. And I'm hoping that with these conversations, we can have critical debates and we can have discussions that will lead to actions, that will lead to real change within these institutions that allow each of us the freedom and the flexibility to grow and thrive our own way on our own respective journeys. Today, I really wanted to just high level talk about mental health and how far we've come. There used to be so much stigma and taboo in relation to mental health, and specifically not being mentally well. And when I say not being mentally well, I don't mean in the worst of cases. I mean having moments, and all of us will have moments where we have life events or different things that happen in our life that make us feel less than optimal. And the fact that those experiences were often experiences where we felt isolated and we felt alone because of the taboo around not being 100% all the time was really tragic. And we've made so many strides, and there's been such progress in being able to have open discussions about mental health and some of the fragility around our mental health. And I think that that's just amazing. What I wanted to talk about when we talk about mental health is just the concept of mental health in and of itself, and some of the dissonance between how we define mental health. I want to kick off this conversation by talking about the misconception that mental health, mental wellness means you are happy all the time. And this is ridiculous, and I have to just kind of be off the cuff and kind of say that out loud, because there's a lot of people who assume that unless you're happy all the time, there's something a little bit off with your mental health. And given the degree of variability in each of our lives, the different events, the different circumstances that we've all faced, the expectation that we are happy all the time is just, it's not a realistic expectation. And if you're assuming that, if your definition of mental health means happiness all the time, you're always satisfied, you're always happy, you're always content, I want to have just a quick chat to level set all of our understanding of what mental health is really about. And all of us carry our own mental health sort of blueprint. And I say that because I think that we always try to figure out what the norm is. What's the normal amount of happiness, the normal amount of anger, the normal amount of sadness. And I hate to break it to all of you, but embracing your mental health also means embracing your emotional, mental footprint. All of us have a different footprint. And what do I mean by that? All of us experience emotions to different extents and to varying degrees and for very varying lengths. We're not all going to respond the same way, and that's okay. We're not all going to take the same amount of time to grieve a certain event, and that's also okay. Not all of us feel anger to the same degrees, and that's okay. This idea of establishing your mental health based on comparison is an idea that's been rooted in our society for far too long, and I think it's about time to deconstruct it. I say that, I mentioned in earlier videos that I'm HSP, so I'm a highly sensitive person. So my spectrum of emotions is fairly broad, and for me, neutrality was something that I've achieved with a lot of mindfulness and meditation. I had mentioned in one of my videos that I came out of the womb fairly high-strung, and when I say high-strung, I am someone who has the capacity to experience emotions very deeply and very intensely, and it took me a lot of time to self-regulate, so a lot of time to be the master of my emotions and not allow my emotions to master me. And also it took me a lot of time to accept the fact that, my emotionality very rarely has translated the same for myself across the peers and the friendships that I've carried. I've always had, a different or an obviously different mental and emotional footprint just by the way of being highly sensitive, a highly sensitive person. A lot of people who meet me will define me as being logical and very rational, and I am those things. And I think that this idea that sensitivity means, sort of irrationality is completely false. Sensitivity and emotionality are not always the same things as well. Being sensitive just means responsive. It means I'm very responsive to events, experiences, and people within my life. And some of those responses, some of how my sensitivity translates is in emotionality. But other ways that my sensitivity might translate is in my moods and the types of moods that I have. And if you think about your mental health, your emotional and mental footprint, you need to know what your norms are. And this idea that there is a set of norms, and that person who sort of fits within that set of norms is the normal, is the archetype of normal within our society, also needs to go away. Because any norm that's been established is based on a cluster of different people who show up that way. And even if you're not the majority, even if you're someone where your normal is an outlier to the normal that's been established by society, it doesn't make you any less normal. And I wanted to have that quick conversation as we talk about mental health today. So I was hoping that, I could leave you with a call to action. And that call to action is sort of putting something tangible in place that outlines your mental and emotional footprint, your own sort of, mental health. Like when you're optimal, when you feel like you're optimal mental health, to what extent do you experience all emotions, all moods, all states of being, because all of them are included in a very healthy, established mental health. And I think that all of us need to really understand our baseline. And a lot of the times we're only made aware of our mental health when it's off. Establishing a baseline is very important. So if you've never really taken the time to reflect and introspect on how you feel normally and how far from that normal you are, to the extent that you feel inclined to seek a professional, then it's up to the professional to kind of establish your baseline to then determine, well, how far from your baseline are you? So then determine if whether or not, you're dealing with a mental health issue or you're dealing with a disordered behavior. And I think that that's really important because that baseline is not the same for everyone. And if we aren't aware of our own emotional, mental baseline, like how we are typically, then it's very hard for us to communicate to someone who's otherwise a stranger, even if they're a mental health practitioner, how far away from that baseline we are. And in the second video that I want to do this week, I'm going to talk about language, the language that we use and we leverage when we communicate our mental health to others, because I think that's very important. But I think we've become very lackadaisical with the language that we use to describe our own mental health and our own states of being. And when I say lax, is we've adopted a lot of terminology that, is psychological terminology that fits us or that labels us as having, a mental health disorder. And it's more sort of a self-diagnosis. We're self-diagnosing ourselves and attributing ourselves these mental health disorders, not recognizing that when you say things When you say I'm depressed because you're going through a breakup and you feel sad, you're typecasting yourself as having a mental health issue that has a neurochemical basis to it, and I think that we need to be very careful with the words that we use to describe ourselves and describe our states of being, and part of that also means sort of expanding our emotional vocabulary. This video is really just talking about our mental health footprint and just establishing that while it's great that we no longer have to deal with as much, I'm not saying that taboos and stigmas are gone. I think we're still dealing with a certain degree of taboos and stigmas as it relates to mental health, especially in very competitive fields or industries or sort of environments that you might place us in, where we're more susceptible to experiencing stigma as it relates to our mental health not being optimal. I think that there's still a lot more openness as it relates to mental health, and I think with that openness we now need to just be very mindful about how we're communicating our mental health to other people and ensuring that we're not labeling ourselves in ways that don't directly reflect our actual state of being. And I say that, and not all of that is our fault. I think some of it is the fact that our society has become so psychologized that all of us think that we're carrying some sort of mental health label. I'm here to try to just put some of that into perspective. I think we look at the metrics, 1 in 4 people are going to have a mental health issue, by the age of 18 even. And we hear that and it's just, okay, what are we doing wrong as a society? But if we counter that with the fact that misdiagnosis has reached 65.9% for depressive disorders. So 65.9% of individuals are misdiagnosed with a depressive disorder. 92.7% of people are misdiagnosed with a bipolar disorder. 85.8% of individuals are misdiagnosed for a panic disorder. 71% of people are misdiagnosed with a general anxiety disorder, and 97.8% of people are misdiagnosed for a social anxiety disorder. And now these numbers are astronomical. And I think part of why these numbers are so astronomical is the fact that we readily carry labels. I think a big reason why the rates of misdiagnosis are so high, one is this blind trust in the medical and the mental health industry. And I had given my opinions about the fact that there isn't enough policing and there's not enough of regulation taking place. I mentioned in an earlier video that when it comes to mental health, when it comes to the interactions we have with our mental health practitioners, there's this blind trust in place. They tell you have this disorder, they tell you have that disorder, and you readily believe them and you take on that label, when it could just be that you're dealing with a life event that aligns with you experiencing those emotions. And I think the idea that mental health means you're happy all the time is also an idea that perpetuates a sense of when I'm not happy, there must be something wrong with me. Life is going to have ups and downs, ebbs and flows. And the way we respond to those ups and downs and ebbs and flows is completely natural. I don't think it would be the appropriate response to be happy if you're dealing with the death of a loved one, unless you're celebrating their life, but you know what I'm trying to say. There are certain events that the response to those events are going to be negative emotions. And I think even the language, negative emotions, I think we need to stop sort of demonizing emotions that are less than positive. I think to reach a place where you accept your full spectrum of emotionality is a place of peace and true acceptance. I know that I am still me when I'm a raging human being. And I have my moments where I told you I'm a yogi, but I'm not peace, love, and acceptance all the time. And that's fine with me. I'm someone who experiences a range of emotions, and I love and accept all of those emotions. There are no emotions within me that I find are too dark to bring out to light. I think that demonizing part of myself and part of my emotional footprint is something that society sort of encourages, and I've completely done away with that. In fact, if I'm being completely transparent, I don't think I ever allowed myself to feel shame for certain emotions that I felt. I think I've always recognized that these emotions, I understand why they show up. If certain things take place, I understand why, I'm angry and I don't feel shame about being angry. It took me a while to recognize that, my anger, there are positive and less than positive ways for it to translate. And that's a different story. But my experiencing anger, my experiencing grief, my experiencing sadness, my experiencing, emotions that, have sort of a negative connotation surrounding them. There's nothing wrong with me for experiencing them. I think it's about creating a toolkit so that even if I'm experiencing those emotions, I'm still showing up my best self. So I'm not allowing myself, I'm still connected to my higher self, even if I'm experiencing an emotion where, I might feel inclined to give myself permission to behave otherwise, to misbehave, let's put it that way. Someone who, comfortably sort of, floats along on both sides of that spectrum of my emotionality and recognizes that there is nothing implicitly wrong with any of the emotions that I experience. It's about creating a set of behaviors so that you're always showing up in a frame of mind where, regardless of how you feel or where you are on the emotional spectrum, you're showing up as your best self, and I think committing to that, committing to not misbehaving when I feel like misbehaving because, I'm experiencing this emotion that makes me feel inclined to behave a certain way, is like, well, how do I always ensure that I'm aligned to my better self? Or better yet, like maybe a better way of saying that is, how do I ensure that when this situation is finished and I go home and I decompress, will I be embarrassed about the way that I interacted with this person? Like, how do I take this emotion and translate it in a way where I'm really proud of myself at the end of the day, regardless of what that emotion is? And I think that's important. And I think that we need to talk more about how we communicate through the lens of different emotional states, so that when we walk away from those circumstances and those situations, we still feel proud of the way that we represented ourselves. And we need to put less focus on not experiencing certain emotions or having certain emotions carry stigma or be demonized, because we all are the sum of all of the emotions that we feel and that we experience. It's just very important that we are the master of our emotions, sort of deal. And I think that when we think about our mental health and our mental and emotional footprint, that is very different from, we think about the behaviors that manifest with those emotions. I think we need to think about emotional footprint. Our mental health is one thing, and then the way we show up within the frame of those specific emotions as a completely different thing. And when we talk about self-awareness, when we talk about emotional intelligence, it's twofold. So emotional intelligence is about monitoring and managing. So the first stage of emotional intelligence is being able to catch yourself in a specific emotional state. So recognize that, I'm transitioning into this emotional state. So a lot of people don't, right? There's a lot of people who are still kind of building their emotional intelligence, and they don't catch themselves. They kind of are caught off guard when they are transitioned into an emotional state. And emotional intelligence, like the first step, is sort of being able to monitor yourself, monitor the degrees of emotionality that are being triggered or that are responding to, events in your environment. And then the second stage of emotional intelligence is management. So the second stage of emotional intelligence is being able to manage those emotions. So you need to be able to monitor your emotions first. So feel different waves of emotionality sort of coming up and within you as you're, navigating through the world around you. And then recognize that there's a time and place, right? And that's management. So there are certain situations where, you might want to respond in a certain way, and maybe that response is appropriate at a different time and at a different place. And that management capacity is the second aspect to emotional intelligence. But recognize emotional intelligence doesn't involve exclusion of certain degrees of emotionality. And I think there's some misconception there. I think the idea that you experience an emotion and in experiencing that emotion there's something wrong with you is false. It's the way we respond in those emotional states, and ensuring that when we do respond in a given emotional state, that we always show up our better selves. That's the journey. I think that's the journey to sort of being the master of our behavior while carrying our emotional and mental footprint. A way of, your emotional being, your mental being, I mean, that is something that is both a combination of nature and nurture. I experience emotions intensely. It has taken a lot of mindfulness and meditation for me to reach this state of peaceful neutrality. But I'm someone who is typically either hot or cold. I'm up or down. I'm very rarely in a state of, readiness. Always one thing or the other thing. And having achieved, and it was definitely a work in progress, but having achieved a state of neutrality, feeling peaceful, feeling neutral, and not feeling like I'm being pulled in a wave in one direction or another. I'm like, wow, this is a great feeling. This is a great place to be, but it's taken work because that wasn't my original mental and emotional blueprint. My mental and emotional blueprint involves intensity. I'm an intense human being. I feel emotions intensely. My states of beings are very, they embody, I embody the emotions that I'm in, and some people aren't that way. And all of the way that we show up mentally and emotionally, all of our blueprints are part of the norm. It's just that the norm, all of our individual normal might be clustered towards, the majority of people's blueprints, which are still their individual blueprints, are further away. And I know I've already figured out and recognized throughout my life that my normal is very much an outlier to the societal, benchmark of, degrees of intensity of emotionality, in terms of my emotional intensity, which means that if I am going to seek out a medical practitioner, which I have done in the past, I recognize the importance of being able to articulate and communicate my norm, my baseline, how frequently or how long I experience certain emotions and how far away from that I am at this specific state in my life and why that has created an issue. And I think we all need to become more aware of our emotional and mental footprint and recognize what our norm is before we raise the flag and say, hey, there's something wrong with me. And if we don't know what our norm is, then it's very hard for a practitioner who doesn't know us to establish of whether or not what we are currently experiencing by way of behavior is deviation from that norm, and recognize that all of our norms are different. I just want to reiterate, the rates of misdiagnosis for mental health disorders is incredibly high. Pharmaceuticals, drugs being prescribed for these emotional states, and that's quite unfortunate because a lot of people are dealing with, chemical imbalances. That's because of the intervention, not because of the original issue that they had. So I want to reiterate, in terms of misdiagnosis, it's reached 65.9% for major depressive disorders. So some of that is our language. We say I'm depressed, and this word depressed has replaced, just feeling down, feeling sad. When we think about that feeling, if we align it to what's happening in our environment, if it's the appropriate response to feel, then that's the feeling that we're in right now, and that's okay. And if you've never taken the time to recognize, how long does it take for me to climb out of sadness typically? How far away, how far removed am I from that standard? If you don't typically know how long it takes you to get over, a heartbreak, but this particular heartbreak, you're like, I feel like it's taking me too long. But you don't actually have a sense of why it feels too long, or maybe it feels worse. Then I think it's important to just monitor it on your own and try to find different strategies to resolve it on your own before you hit yourself with the label of, oh, I have a depressive disorder, because a lot of people who are being diagnosed with depressive disorders don't actually have depression, and a lot of the medication that is used to treat depression will change the neurochemistry of your brain. And I already spoke about why that is not something you want to do. And 92% of people are misdiagnosed with bipolar disorder, and 85% of people with a panic disorder. And not to say that those people who are seeking support, it doesn't mean you're not experiencing a degree of emotionality that you need support with. You probably, I'm not trying to invalidate your experience. I'm just saying that your experience is part of the normal. right? And you're trusting a medical practitioner that is incentivized to label you as ill when, having emotions, there's nothing inherently wrong with having emotions that are not happy, and I think part of why we have such high rates of misdiagnosis across the spectrum of major mood disorders is because we've demonized emotions that are less than happy and that are less than satisfied, that are less than content. And I think that we need to start to really distinguish between our emotional footprint and the varying emotions that we feel, the intensity by which we feel those emotions, the length, the average length by which we experience those emotions individually, and change our language to exclude behavioral responses as completely separate. Because our emotional footprint is what it is. And I think our personal journey is about making sure that regardless of what emotion that we're experiencing, we're showing up, always representing our best self, like always articulating ourselves, regardless of the emotion that we're in a way where when we walk away from that conversation, we've done ourselves proud. And I'm telling you, I'm not there 100% yet. I think for me, it's really truly been a journey. Like I was someone who was definitely very much ruled by my emotions for the majority of my, childhood, adolescent life. But, as an adult, it was only going to help myself to ensure that when I walk away from an interaction, I'm always doing myself proud. I'm like, how do I best represent myself while experiencing this emotion? And it was less about demonizing the emotions that I was experiencing. And there's nothing wrong with any of the emotions that I've experienced and, experience in my life. It's just making sure that in that state of emotionality, am I still sort of showing up as my higher self? Am I still being true to my higher self? Am I still sort of representing my best self, regardless of how badly I might feel inclined to misbehave? So I think that's what I wanted to talk about. I just wanted to talk mental health and talk about this idea that mental health is about positive emotions. It's not. And I want to talk about, just changing your language. There are no negative and positive emotions. There are just emotions. There are negative and positive behaviors. And I think that is completely separate from our emotional footprint and our emotional and mental footprint. And I think that we need to start just accepting the range of emotions that we show up with. There's no part, I want everyone to feel who you are is who you are. The range of emotions that you experience are the range of emotions that you experience. No one can tell you there's something wrong with you because of the degrees and the intensity of emotionality that you experience. I think, though, if you find that when you're in a state of being, if you're experiencing an emotion, you feel regret and shame by the way you've decided to show up, which is different. It's sort of the behavioral manifestation that has aligned itself to that emotion, then that's not there being something wrong with you. That's just, okay, well, that's the point of growth. How do I ensure that I show up as my best self when I experience this emotion, and what strategies and tools do I need to leverage in order to do that? I'm glad, again, that the taboo and the stigma around mental health is shifting, it's changing, where there's a lot more forgiveness for not being okay, and there's a lot more, I think it's becoming much more normalized in different spaces where, the expectation that you're okay all the time is just an unrealistic expectation. We're not robots, we're existential, we're emotional beings as well as cerebral beings. Like, we need to start embracing both aspects of our humanity. And we also need to stop genderifying that, because men and women, however it is you translate on your journey, all of us experience degrees of emotionality. And it's great that we're having open dialogue, but it's also important that we're not mislabeling ourselves and we're not assigning ourselves an emotional or a mental health issue that doesn't exist. And based on the rates of misdiagnosis, that's definitely happening. High-level conversation about, mental health and talking about mental health and giving you my perspective on what our mental health is. Mental health is, again, is a full spectrum of emotionality, whatever your current state is. when we talk about mental health, when we talk about our mental health, it's not about framing that as this positive thing. Our mental health is a combination of who we are mentally and emotionally, and also the spectrum of emotions and states of being that exist, you know, in the day-to-day. And I think that normalizing all of the degrees of emotions and states of being within that spectrum, and then recognizing that if you're behaving in a way where you don't feel the best after that interaction, then that doesn't mean that you demonize the emotion. It means that you work on the behavior to ensure that that behavior aligns with you showing up as your best self and feeling proud of the way that you represented yourself in that moment. So I wanted to have that quick discussion with you. I hope that, you know, I hope that that was helpful. I hope that that provides perspective. And if you have a different perspective, if you have a different point of view, I really would love to hear it. I mean, we're having a lot of open dialogue about, you know, mental illness, but I want to make sure that we're not embracing a label of mental illness when we're completely okay. So that's this video. Thank you so much for watching. And again, if you've made it to the end, please subscribe to the channel. I would love to have you as part of our community. And of course, be sure to like, comment, and share this video. Talk to you soon.